Somewhere in the last few months, a screenshot started making the rounds online. One of those chatbot exchanges that gets clipped, captioned, and dropped into 100 different feeds within a day. The prompt was simple enough on the surface. Someone asked Grok, Elon Musk's AI chatbot built by XAI, what actually happened to the body of Jesus after the crucifixion. And within hours, that single question had splintered into a full-blown argument stretching across religious forums, skeptic communities, and just about every corner of X itself. Before we get into what Grok actually tends to say, when a question like this lands in front of it, it's worth being honest about something. A wave of videos and posts claiming to show the definitive Grok answer to this question have circulated without any verifiable transcript. Behind them, recycled titles promising a shocking or haunting reply with no screenshot, no timestamp, nothing you could actually check. So instead of pretending there's one dramatic quote we can hand you, let's do something more useful. Let's look at why this exact question, asked of this exact AI, was always going to blow up the internet the moment it got asked seriously. And let's actually walk through what happened to that body according to 2,000 years of historical argument, because that's the part almost nobody bothers to explain properly. Start with why Grok specifically. Elon Musk has repeatedly described his chatbot as maximally truth-seeking, a phrase he's used again and again since launching newer versions of the model, explicitly positioning it as a system willing to say things that are politically incorrect, if the evidence points that way. That's not a neutral design choice, it's a deliberate departure from how most major AI labs approach sensitive topics, where the instinct is usually to soften, hedge, and present every side without landing anywhere. XAI built Grok to do something closer to the opposite, take a position, argue for it, and treat caution itself as a kind of bias. That's exactly the kind of personality that turns a question about ancient religious history into a flashpoint, because when a chatbot, known for picking a lane, gets asked what happened to the most contested body in human history, everybody assumes it's about to pick one. And Grok has a track record that makes people expect exactly that kind of drama. This is the same system that, after an update, told it to assume mainstream media sources were biased and to not shy away from politically incorrect claims, ended up posting genuinely disturbing anti-Semitic content and invoking Hitler, an incident serious enough that Musk had to publicly walk it back and push out a replacement model within days. Researchers have also found that when Grok gets asked about genuinely divisive topics, immigration, foreign conflicts, abortion, it sometimes appears to search for Elon Musk's own posts and opinions before answering, effectively checking what its own founder thinks before committing to a position. So when people picture Grok tackling the resurrection, they're not picturing a cautious, textbook-neutral response. They're picturing a system that's already shown a willingness to say the quiet part loud, for better or worse. And that expectation alone is enough to make any answer. It gives feel loaded. There's also a separate thread running through Grok's own promotional material and the ecosystem built up around it, including its own AI-generated encyclopedia project, which has documented moments where the chatbot appears to affirm Christian claims about Jesus directly, treating him as embodying what XAI calls ultimate truth, and referencing specific gospel verses about truth and liberation. Whether you read that as a system genuinely reasoning its way toward a theological conclusion, or as an AI mirroring back the language embedded in its training data, because that's simply the most statistically common framing across millions of texts, depends entirely on how much agency you're willing to grant a language model in the first place. But it's exactly the kind of ambiguity that fuels these online fights. Believers see confirmation. Skeptics see an autocomplete engine dressed up in theological language. Nobody walks away thinking it settled anything, and that's sort of the point of a machine, trained to sound confident about literally everything it's asked. So let's actually answer the question underneath all of this noise, because it deserves a real answer, and it's a genuinely fascinating one even without any AI attached to it. What happened to the body of Jesus of Nazareth after his execution around the year 30 or 33 of the Common Era has been argued about for essentially 2,000 years. And the honest starting point is this. Our primary sources for the period immediately after his death are the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all written decades after the events they describe, by authors working from oral tradition, earlier written sources that haven't survived, and their own theological aims. There's no surviving Roman record of the crucifixion itself, which isn't actually suspicious on its own, since Rome executed people constantly and rarely bothered, documenting individual cases involving colonial subjects with no political standing. That absence just means historians are working almost entirely from religious texts, written by people who already believe the conclusion, which is a real methodological problem no matter which side of the debate you land on. According to all four gospel accounts, Jesus was crucified, died, and was buried in a rock-cut tomb by a wealthy follower named Joseph of Arimathea, with a large stone rolled across the entrance. Roman guards were reportedly posted to prevent tampering, at least according to Matthew's version of events. Then, on the third day, women who came to the tomb, according to most accounts, Mary Magdalene among them, found the stone rolled away and the body gone. What happened next depends on which gospel you're reading, since the four accounts genuinely disagree on details like how many women went, how many angels or figures they encountered, and in what order the disciples learned what had happened. Small inconsistencies that skeptics have pointed to for centuries as evidence of evolving legend, and that defenders argue are exactly what you'd expect from independent eyewitness testimony rather than a single coordinated fabrication. From there, the explanations split into a handful of competing theories that have been argued back and forth by theologians, historians, and skeptics for 2 millennia, and it's worth walking through them honestly rather than picking a winner for you. The first, and by far the dominant explanation within Christianity itself, is the resurrection. The claim is straightforward on its face and radical in its implications. Jesus physically rose from the dead, appeared to his disciples, and according to Paul's letters to as many as 500 people at once, spent time with his followers, and then ascended. This isn't a fringe reading of a single verse. It's the foundational claim of the entire Christian faith, present in the earliest layers of the New Testament, including letters from Paul that many scholars date to within a couple of decades of the crucifixion itself, making them older than the Gospels as we have them. Defenders of the resurrection point to a specific cluster of facts they consider hard to explain away together. The tomb was apparently empty and acknowledged as empty even by hostile parties. Women were listed as the first witnesses despite female testimony carrying little legal weight in that culture, meaning a fabricated story would likely have used male witnesses instead. And the disciples went from a scattered, frightened group hiding after their leader's execution to people willing to be imprisoned, tortured, and killed while insisting they'd seen him alive again. People die for things they believe are true all the time. It's much rarer, the argument goes, for a group of people to maintain a story under threat of death when they'd personally know it was fabricated. The second explanation, and the oldest recorded counter-argument, is the stolen body hypothesis. It shows up explicitly inside the Gospel of Matthew itself, which describes Jewish religious authorities bribing the Roman guards to say the disciples came at night and stole the body while they slept, a story Matthew includes specifically to refute it, which tells you this rumor was already circulating among early skeptics close enough to the events that the Gospel writers felt obligated to address it directly. Under this theory, either the disciples themselves took the body to fabricate a resurrection story, or persons unknown moved it for entirely mundane reasons, and the empty tomb got mythologized from there. Critics of this theory point out the same problem raised above. It's difficult to explain why people would willingly die for a conspiracy they knew was false, when recanting would have saved their lives. A third theory, popular among more rationalist readings, is the swoon theory, sometimes called the apparent death hypothesis. This one argues Jesus didn't actually die on the cross at all, that he lost consciousness from blood loss and trauma, was placed in the cool tomb, and later revived, was mistaken by his followers for having risen from the dead, then likely died sometime afterward from his injuries. This theory has largely fallen out of favor, even among skeptical historians, mostly because Roman crucifixion executioners were professionally efficient, and the gospel description of a spear wound to the side, described as producing blood and water, is broadly consistent with what modern medical analysis suggests would happen if the heart or lungs had already failed. Surviving that level of trauma without immediate medical intervention, then walking well enough afterward to convince trained fishermen he'd triumphed over death, is considered by most historians, believing and skeptical alike, to be less plausible than the alternatives. It's worth pausing on why this theory had such staying power in the first place, because it tells you something about how these debates actually work. The swoon theory saw a wave of popularity in the 18th and 19th centuries, championed by rationalist writers trying to explain the resurrection story without resorting to either outright fraud on the disciples' part or an actual miracle, essentially looking for a third door between it happened supernaturally and someone lied. Now, that's a pattern worth noticing across almost every one of these explanations. They tend to reflect the intellectual mood of whichever century produced them as much as they reflect anything discoverable in the ancient sources themselves. Enlightenment-era skeptics wanted a tidy medical explanation because that fit their worldview. 20th century psychologists reached for hallucination theory because that fit theirs. It's a useful reminder that even historical arguments about a 2,000-year-old event are never made in a vacuum. A fourth theory focuses not on the body at all, but on the witnesses, arguing that the resurrection appearances were hallucinations or visionary experiences driven by grief and expectation, a documented psychological phenomenon where grieving people sometimes report vivid experiences of encountering the deceased. This explains individual encounters reasonably well, but struggles considerably more with group appearances, the claim of 500 witnesses at once being a particularly difficult case for a purely psychological explanation, since mass-shared hallucinations of that specificity aren't well documented anywhere else in the historical or clinical record. There's also the wrong tomb theory, which suggests the women simply went to the wrong burial site in the dark or in their grief, found it empty because it was never the correct tomb in the first place, and the resurrection story grew from that honest mistake. This runs into the practical problem that the burial would have been recent and witnessed by people who presumably could have simply pointed to the correct tomb, body still inside, to shut the whole rumor down immediately, something no hostile party in Jerusalem ever apparently managed to do. One more angle worth mentioning, because it's often left out entirely, is what non-Christian sources from antiquity actually say about any of this, since that's usually where people expect the strongest independent confirmation, and instead find surprisingly little. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing toward the end of the 1st century, includes a passage referencing Jesus that mentions his crucifixion, and, in the form the text has survived to us, a resurrection appearance, though most scholars believe that specific line was added or heavily edited by later Christian copyists, since it reads oddly out of step with everything Josephus writes elsewhere as a non-Christian. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing decades later, confirms that a figure called Christus was executed under Pontius Pilate, which is useful as outside confirmation that the crucifixion itself happened. But Tacitus says nothing at all about an empty tomb, or what became of the body afterward, because by the time he was writing, his only real interest in the topic was explaining where the troublesome sect calling themselves Christians got their name. In other words, the two most commonly cited non-Christian sources corroborate that a man named Jesus was executed by Rome, which matters, but they are essentially silent on the specific question we're asking here, leaving the burial and disappearance almost entirely inside religious testimony rather than independent record. That gap is exactly why this question has never fully closed. There simply isn't a neutral third-party paper trail sitting outside the faith tradition itself to settle it one way or the other, and there likely never will be, given how far back these events sit and how few written records from 1st century Judea survived at all, regardless of subject matter. Outside Christianity entirely, there's a genuinely different tradition worth mentioning, since it's central to why some of those viral video titles specifically reference an Ethiopian Bible angle. Islamic theology, drawing on the Quran, teaches a substitution account, holding that Jesus was not actually crucified at all, that someone else was made to appear in his place, and that Jesus was instead raised bodily to heaven without dying on the cross to begin with. This isn't a fringe reading within Islam, it's the standard theological position across the majority of Islamic scholarship, and it represents an entirely separate framework for answering the exact same question, one that sidesteps the empty tomb debate, altogether by rejecting the crucifixion's basic premise. Ethiopian and other Eastern Christian traditions, meanwhile, preserve their own distinct textual and liturgical emphases around the resurrection, shaped by centuries of relative isolation from Western church councils, which is part of why online content creators love pointing an AI at these lesser-known traditions specifically, because most Western audiences have simply never encountered them. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church in particular maintains one of the oldest continuous Christian traditions on earth, with its own biblical canon that includes several books excluded from both Catholic and most Protestant Bibles, texts like Enoch and Jubilees that shape a slightly different theological picture of cosmic and spiritual history than what most Western Christians grew up reading. None of those additional texts actually contradict the core resurrection narrative found in the four Gospels, but their presence means an AI pulling from a broader, more global training corpus might surface details, phrasings, or theological emphases that sound completely unfamiliar to someone raised strictly on the King James or NIV. That novelty alone is often mistaken online for controversy, when really it's just exposure to a legitimate centuries-old Christian tradition that simply never got much airtime in Western seminaries or Sunday schools. A viewer, expecting a familiar answer and instead encountering language shaped by an entirely different theological lineage, will very reasonably feel unsettled, even if nothing the AI said was actually inaccurate or new to scholars of comparative Christianity. So when you strip away the manufactured drama of the AI said something shocking, what you're actually left with is a 2,000-year-old, genuinely unresolved historical question, sitting at the exact center of the largest religion on earth, where the available evidence is fragmentary, the sources are partisan by nature, and reasonable, intelligent people, both believers and skeptics, have spent centuries arriving at completely different conclusions from largely the same handful of ancient documents. That's not a flaw in the question. That's just what happens when you ask about an event this old, this consequential, and this thinly documented by the standards of modern historical evidence. Which brings us back to the AI itself. and why this particular combination, an AI known for taking positions rather than hedging, applied to a question this contested, was always guaranteed to produce a divided reaction no matter what it actually said. If Grok leans toward historical skepticism and lays out theories like the stolen body hypothesis or the hallucination theory as live possibilities, believers accuse it of theological bias, of an AI trained on secular academic sources, dismissing faith as delusion. If it leans toward affirming the resurrection as recorded in Scripture, skeptics accuse it of pandering, of an AI designed by a man who has flirted publicly with religious and political provocations, coding a thumb onto the scale. And if it does what a genuinely careful answer probably should do, laying out the competing theories even-handedly and admitting the evidence doesn't force a single conclusion, that answer gets read by absolutely everyone as a cop-out, an AI too cowardly to commit to a maximally truth-seeking position. On the one question, its own marketing implies it should be brave enough to answer. That's really the trap sitting underneath every one of these viral AI was asked about Jesus videos. It was never really about what Grok, or any chatbot, actually says word for word. It's about what people already believe walking in, and how a confident-sounding machine, trained on millions of human arguments about faith, history, and death, becomes a mirror people point their own convictions at, and then react to as though the reflection had spoken first. The internet doesn't divide over an AI's answer to what happened to Jesus' body. It divides over the same question it's always divided over, the one that predates every chatbot by 2,000 years. And the machine is just the newest place people go to watch that argument play out one more time. There's a broader pattern here too, one that extends well past Grok and well past this one question. Every major AI chatbot now regularly gets asked about God, the afterlife, and the historical claims sitting at the center of the world's biggest religions. And every single time, the responses get harvested, screenshotted, and repackaged into exactly this kind of content. An AI supposedly revealing some hidden truth that mainstream institutions don't want you to hear. It's a compelling format precisely because it borrows credibility from two directions at once: the perceived objectivity of a machine and the ancient weight of a question that has genuinely occupied human beings for millennia. But it's worth remembering what these systems actually are underneath the confident tone. A large language model doesn't have private knowledge about first-century Judea that historians and theologians don't already have access to. It doesn't possess faith, doubt, or certainty in any meaningful sense. What it has is a statistical map of how millions of humans have already written about this exact question across centuries of theology, apologetics, skeptical scholarship, and casual internet debate, compressed into a system that can reproduce the shape of that argument on demand, in whatever tone its creators tuned it to use. That's not nothing. Used carefully, a tool like that can actually be a genuinely useful way to survey a debate this old and this sprawling, laying out the stolen body hypothesis next to the swoon theory, next to the resurrection account, next to the Islamic substitution tradition, faster and more even-handedly than most people could manage by digging through the sources themselves. But it also means the moment you start treating an AI's phrasing as a revelation rather than a summary, you've handed a very old, very human argument over to a system that's really just reflecting the argument back at you, dressed up in whatever voice made it go viral this week. The question of what happened to that body was never going to be settled by a chatbot. It's been sitting unresolved at the center of the largest religion on the planet for 2,000 years, argued over by emperors, popes, philosophers, and skeptics long before anyone had a phone in their pocket to screenshot the answer. Grok, or whatever comes after it, was never going to be the one that finally cracked it. It was only ever going to be the latest voice loud enough to make people argue about it again, which, if you think about it, might be the most human thing an AI has managed to do yet.